Hey First Son fans, this is Tommy from First Son. I wanted to go over one of my most successful and most listened to tracks of all time. This is Below Zero, and we're doing the making of Below Zero. So a couple things to note before we dive right in is I wanted to make a couple things clear about the music. So all of the music is handmade. There's no samples from any of the Subnautica tracks that are used here, though the hook is pretty much the same as Abandoned Ship. And the reason for that is I'm actually good friends with Simon, the original composer for Subnautica, and I noticed that he had a pretty good theme going on with Abandoned Ship and reusing that theme and that hook. So I wanted to take it a step further and kind of theorize what it would be like to have a Below Zero world, a Below Zero universe, separate kind of from Subnautica, but tie in the theme. So you'll kind of hear the same Abandoned Ship theme in Below Zero, the track, but most of the other instruments, everything else here, it's all handmade, and even the part that kind of pulls off the same theme as Simon's stuff is all handmade as well. You'll also notice this piano part here, which is pretty much that Abandoned Ship theme here, and it's just written in by hand. And so there's no samples here. I'm not using any of Simon's work. And another thing to note about this track was that I was homeless during the time while I was making these tracks, and I didn't really have a lot of time to compose them the way that I wanted to. But the reason why I made these tracks in the very beginning was I was applying to Unknown Worlds Entertainment as the sound designer and composer for that position, and I was recommended by a friend of mine that works there. And he mentioned to me, he said, why don't you, along with your resume for sound design, why don't you send us a couple tracks as well in the Subnautica kind of style? And all I had was a 10-year-old laptop and a little bit of time. And so rather than going and creating all the sounds from scratch, I kind of just used some patches and plugins and things that I had and just whipped up something quick. And I think the total time for this track wasn't very long at all, actually. So I think the total time on this track was probably I would say maybe a few hours. So if I go to the project info settings here, so the total time spent on this track was 5 hours and 46 minutes, and that's with the editor open now, which is also adding time, and there's no telling how many times I've opened this project after the song was released. So I would probably estimate that I spent about 4 hours total on this track. Not a whole lot of time, but I tend to be really quick at turning tracks around and creating them when I'm inspired, and I can put them together within maybe 2 to 3 hours. Sometimes it takes a lot longer than that. But I just wanted to give a little bit of information prior to jumping directly into the track. So let's go ahead and jump in, and I'll explain some of these different plugins and some of the samples and things that I'm using here. So there's the Jericho kit that I'm using here. There's some basic samples that I have just laying around in different libraries. I have no idea what VTDS2 is, but apparently I'm also using that. And then you'll also notice here at the very beginning, there's another VTDS2. There's really not a bunch of samples in here. It's mostly automations and just repeating patterns and things like that. One thing that I should note is that missing out of this is the little growl part at the beginning of the track. For some reason, it couldn't find the sample that I created to do this, and I was too lazy to go and browse for it. If you're an artist or a composer and you have a hard time finding samples, there's a good chance you'll probably never find it. So I'm just going to, these little red marks here, you may not be able to see them, but those are missing samples, and that's the only missing sample I think out of this entire track here. So I don't know why it's not there. But moving along, so the first thing you notice in this track is just kind of that pounding bass. This is a Moog bass, and I use it quite a lot in composing many of my tracks. And let's just have a listen. So yeah, it's just a Moog bass. I've turned it down a bit and kind of given it a little bit more punchy feeling. And then of course I have this kind of triplet sound coming in through. So triplet, that's coming through. And you can hardly notice it, but what that does is it allows me to bring this percussion and this kick in, and that accents it a little bit more. And then I don't have to sidechain it. And sidechaining is basically when you send the signal from one channel to another channel. And you may choose to limit the other channel and duck its total dB level by just a bit so that it ducks when other signals are being pushed through. So to give an idea of what it sounds like with the effects and the kick and bass all playing. Another thing to notice here is with this effect, we have a kind of a percussive effect going as well. So it's further enforcing this kind of kick and that feel of just kind of keeping the 4 on the floor beat that everyone seems to love so much. And then also there's this percussion part as well. It's a percussive part that comes, I believe, directly from here. So this is Signal. And so what you're hearing is a custom patch from Signal, and it's been modified a couple different ways to make it kind of sound and feel the way that I want it to. So again, keeping that 4 on the floor beat and making it super percussive. And so when we add all those together, we get this. Cool. So then we have this lead that kind of slowly comes in, and you'll notice that's the hook from Abandoned Ship. Okay, cool. So what you'll notice that kind of started right after that are these keys here. So we kind of have this soft section where we pull in the breeze and the chilliness of Below Zero. And this is where we kind of break off from it just being a Subnautica song to being a Subnautica Below Zero song. And so what you'll notice here is there's a lot of kind of pad and atmosphere that's down here that kind of goes along with these keys that without it doesn't really sound chilly at all. It just sounds like keys. So I'll play it first with the keys in here. I'll play the entire phrase and the entire passage, and then I'll come and re-add the atmosphere in here, and you can clearly tell the difference of the atmosphere pad. And both of these, I believe, are coming from Omnisphere. So let's have a listen. So you can hear the tail end of that reverb that's just kind of swallowing the entire sound, and that's giving it kind of the first part of the cold and chilliness effect. But when you add that atmosphere in there, then you get the breeze and everything else, and just kind of give you an idea of what it sounds like. You can kind of hear this swirling breeze that's kind of circulating around. Right, and so then when we add everything together, we get this. And about this time, we kick that bass back in. We build up into our kind of our main drop area, I guess you could call it. And this really kind of opens the floodgates and gets all the melodies and different percussive elements all together. But just to give an idea of what it was like kind of at that fill area, just that small area in between here, there's just kind of this area of silence where we build up into that. So this section here was a little bit difficult because of the way that it was syncopated, but you get the idea. And then of course we have these FX fills here where we just kind of go through and kind of fill that empty area and build up into the big part like this. Notice we changed the kick and snare up here a little bit. We have this kind of offbeat snare that comes in, and we've got the same hats, but then we've also got these voices that come in. So I have this kind of thing that I do in a lot of my songs where, if you notice here, there's the root note, third, fifth, and sometimes a seventh, and then there's a ninth, and then I just keep going, and it ends up doing this thing where when I switch into the second phrase here, I kind of keep that top ninth, or that's a ninth, and then come back down into the seventh, and then back up to the ninth again, and back to the seventh, while the fifth and the thirds are changing into minors and majors and doing kind of these intermingling within. So they end up becoming like these very full major and minor chords that are almost diminished and just very interesting. I'm certainly not the first person in the world to do it, but it's just something that seems prominent in a lot of my tracks, and I wanted to point that out, was these top notes here. You'll notice it goes from a fifth to a seventh into a ninth, and then even higher, and then jumps back down, and then back up, back down, but it never comes back down to a third or a fifth. In fact, all the lower notes, I actually add the sevenths and fifths back in as individual notes and keep the higher thirds in there. So just kind of an interesting way of thinking about how you do chording. It's nothing super special, but works for me, and I like it a lot. And then of course there's the saws, and the saws kind of bring a lot of the feeling into the track. Yes, and they're arpeggiated as well. So when you kind of get to this section, you've got this first section here that kind of is doing its thing, and then you have this really awesome saw arpeggio going on, and it really adds a lot to the track. Super interesting, where I got the kind of triplets and extra rolls in, was if you look here, there's actually a kick sample that I'm using, and I just chopped it up and chopped it up into specific divisions to get that sound. So we've got the so you can see that here. Also, in this section, I'm also raising the pitch just by a little bit. So what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of raising that pitch over time, so that these kicks don't hit against each other in a way that makes them kind of cancel out and make the track sound a little bit too kick heavy. So there's nothing that I'm doing that's really crazy in here, which was why I was so blown away by how many people, just thousands and thousands of people, really just love this track so much. And I'm so thankful that everyone loves it as much as they do. I didn't put a lot of time into it, and it just makes me wonder that had I put so much more time into it, I wonder what things would have been like then. Would it have been better? Would it have been worse? But I'm happy just knowing that I feel like it's just right. It's the right amount of complexity, it's the right amount of dance, it's the right amount kind of getting the feeling there, and it's something that you can dance to, or you can just kind of nod your head along with, and I'm really happy with that. Typically, a lot of my tracks are a lot more experimental, and there's a lot more syncopation, and I'm doing all kinds of sound design and things like that. This song is the absolute opposite of that. It's the complete, opposite of what I typically do, and which is why I guess I was so surprised, pleasantly surprised that it really took off. So just to kind of give an idea of some of the plugins that I used for this, for those that are interested in knowing kind of a little bit deeper. So the total tracks here is somewhere along the lines of, I think it's, there's 29 tracks that are being used up here. And then just to kind of go through some of the effects chain here, I've got Ozone 8 on the master. So Ozone 8 is a mastering plugin that kind of handles a lot of the compression and limiting and kind of spectral analysis and things like that. And just to kind of go through and give an idea here. So the stereo enhancer is a plugin that I use quite frequently. It's through ImageLine, and it's a plugin that basically takes a signal and spreads it out a little bit. It's a good way to cheat if you have a mono signal, or if you have a stereo signal that you want to fatten up just a little bit more. You can definitely do that. It'll split that signal out as much as it possibly can. And so you can see another one here. Now the stereo shaper is a little bit different, but it works kind of the same way as the stereo enhancer. does, and the stereo shaper kind of allows you to sculpt where in the field that you want a sound to be playing. Rather than just spreading the signal out, you can decide kind of where at specifically you want that sound to play. Do you want it in the front of the headphones or speakers? Do you want it kind of sitting in the back? Do you want it spread far out, far left and right? Does it need to sound distant? Does it need to sound close? This is how you could sculpt that. And so on our bass, I just have a simple EQ here where I just raise the mid just a little bit, and I actually dropped off the super low sub. Helps with getting rid of some of the artifacts that come along with using bass and some of the aliasing that ends up on the low end. And then of course I've got fast LP here on the kick drum, and the fast LP is a good way. And remember how I was saying before that I was kind of changing the pitch a little bit? Well, I wasn't entirely correct when I said that. I'm more changing the cutoff and the resonance of the kick, which in turn is kind of raising the decibels on specific hertz. So kind of it's raising the volume level. It's raising the level of a certain frequency range as I'm progressing through that area. So it's not necessarily changing the pitch, but it's raising the decibel level of certain hertz ranges, which basically, translates to pitch. And so then I'm running that cutoff here, where it basically just kind of slowly it makes it muffled sounding and then brings it in. So the cutoff just basically cuts off some of the frequencies, and as I open it up, then you get the full frequency spectrum. So to just kind of give an idea, I'll go ahead and detach this and show you once again when I play that section. So you can see it there automating, and it's kind of messing around with the cutoff. It's bringing it down as I go through the roll, and then it's also setting that resonance and bringing it up really quickly so that it gives it this sense of pitch. So that's a neat little thing that you can do to just make your kicks, when you're using the same sample and you want it to stand out a bit, you can do that. It'll help a little bit. And then I've got the percussion, which we went through already, and silent one, which is absolutely fantastic, especially for trance music. There's lots of great presets in there. I highly recommend it. The keys, I don't know exactly what I used for the keys, so let's have a look. So it's ambient space piano. So just give you an idea of what that sounds like. And so that's the piano that you're hearing play in between the hard part and kind of the more and the transition into the main drop here. So that's this section here. That's what you're hearing, those keys. And of course the atmosphere. A lot of this was used by Omnisphere because it was one of the only plugins that I had installed on a 10-year-old laptop with just barely any kind of processing power. I'm actually quite surprised it didn't die while I was composing the entire thing. It did really well. So most of these are actually just extra versions of Omnisphere, and then of course you can see here the kick samples and things that I'm using, and the voices, which is probably also Omnisphere. Yep, it is. And then of course you can see here that I've got all this percussion that kind of comes into a mixed bus here, and so all of this percussion that I'm using comes into this bus, and I've got one thing that I really like to do a lot is I like to use the Panomatic on it. And what ends up happening when I solo those is you get this kind of swirly, syncopated drum beat kind of in your ears, and it's revolving around your entire head and kind of giving you this sense that everything around you is moving. Something that I've been doing for years and years. I kind of picked that up from Ben Jordan. I look up to him pretty heavily for a lot of inspiration on techniques and things like that, and he does this a lot with his beats, a lot of his drum tracks and things like that. And so this is kind of my way of imitating his style in that sense. So If I can get to a part, here we go. So you can hear. If I turn all this off, that's what it sounds like without. So to give an idea of what we actually went through in this chamber, we first spread the signal out. Then we add reverb to it. Finally, we start panning it. And you can still hear it revolving around. So when everything's playing at once, you don't really necessarily hear all of that. If you pay very, very close attention, you might hear it. But it's just there to fill up some of the empty space and provide some more kind of soundscape in between those empty areas. So maybe if you listen really closely, you might be able to hear it. It's hardly even audible, if audible at all, but just that little bit where it's kind of playing in the background is just enough to fill in some of the empty space. So when your ears aren't paying attention to maybe the main lead or something like that, and you're not getting the masking from some of the louder sounds that are playing, what ends up happening is you're hearing kind of these little things kind of spinning around in a circle around your head. So when you're least paying attention is when you begin to hear the tiny little sounds in. And these things are just like, they're cookies. I like to call them things like cookies or cake. You know, they're extra things that you didn't really hear it at first, but now that you've heard it, you kind of can't get enough of it, right? Like there's these little intricacies that you hear within the track when you're least paying attention to it. There's a phenomenon going on where masking basically creates, humans only hear the loudest sound that's being played. That's what they pay attention to. So when they're least paying attention to the track, that's when those sounds kind of come through and you're like, wait a second, I just heard something that I haven't heard before. So just kind of giving some interesting stuff both on the masking side of things and on the opposite end of the spectrum as well. When you're least paying attention, you'll hear other things. And these are ways that we can manipulate the human brain into paying attention again. And what's funny is that once you start paying attention to it again, your brain kicks on as like, what's the loudest thing that's playing? Let me focus on that. And then it goes away. So it's really interesting. You'll only ever really hear it when you're not expecting it or paying attention to it. And I love those kinds of little brain tricks. So let's just play the whole track all the way through. Apologies again that I don't have the little growly sound sample in here. I don't know where it is. It's in a black hole somewhere. I hope you enjoyed this video and kind of the deep dive into Subnautica Below Zero, the track from the Unofficial Soundtrack. See you on the next video.